WaterCooler Wednesday. Today is a very special episode. Do I say that every week? Alicia might know because she's make sure to tune in like every time, which is really cool. But Alicia does a lot more than just watch WaterCooler. First of all, she's incredibly has this incredible intellectual curiosity around work. I always know that I can go to Alicia if I need a recommendation for a book or a podcast or whatever. She's always there. She lives and breathes this stuff. So I'm so excited to welcome Alicia as our guest today on the water cooler. Here's the I work with we bring on a lot of speakers and consultants and other people with giant egos. And so when I ask them to send me their bio, it's like 14 pages long. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but like clearly written by their mom. And what I asked Alicia for her bio and she sent me like 4 words. But what I can tell you is that Alicia is an industrial organizational psychology practitioner. She is a dedicated HR director, a part-time photographer, which was news to me. That's pretty cool. And a mom of 4. I had the honor of having Alicia in a couple of my classes at the University of Maryland's IO Psychology Master's Program. Shout out to them. Where I learned more from her than she could ever learn from me. And what I learned about Alicia very quickly was that she is absolutely fearless and a passionate champion for the truth and for fair and equitable treatment of everybody within the workplace, which is really cool. I've never seen her back down from a fight that's worth fighting. And that's why I am so excited to have Alicia here today to talk about some of her favorite things. How's it going, Alicia? Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure how to follow that introduction, but I'll do my best. Thank you so much for the very kind and descriptive words.
So here's the deal. We always start with the 6 and 60. 6 rapid fire questions. You know the drill. You also know that people don't usually get them in 60 seconds, but if anybody can, I think it's you. So, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. When you're feeling overwhelmed or burned out, what do you do to reset and recharge?
Breathe.
You describe yourself as a professional late bloomer. What's one piece of advice you would give to other career changers or late bloomers?
Give yourself grace.
If you could change one thing about the world of HR, what would that be?
Bias and assumptions.
Mm. Best piece of advice or wisdom you've ever received?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'd have to go back to breathe.
You are always learning, and like I said, you're always giving me recommendations. Can you recommend one book or podcast that you've been into lately to our audience?
Yeah, Brene Brown's Dare to Lead has kind of been my Bible of podcasts.
And in 5 words or less, what's the meaning of life?
Connection.
Mm, you did it. And with 1 word. That's amazing. Awesome. So breathe. I love that. Um,
hmm
that's so do you do that on the fly or do you actually take time and find a private space to breathe? What does that look like? Breathing to you.
So I would say both. There are times where things can be very overwhelming, even if it's on the fly, right in the middle of a meeting. When I start to feel myself either get overwhelmed or even a little heated, the first thing that I want to do is just deep breaths, and it's counting them. It's being present in the moment and allowing those feelings, those really intense feelings, whatever they are, to kind of wash over you and just release them with each breath. It's kind of making a mini meditation in the moment, and then throughout the day I will set aside time. I go on walks, and that provides me, the nature, the environment, to really kind of let a lot of those thoughts go from the day, even if it's just for 5 to 10 minutes. It's really about creating that blank space in your mind to which really can allow the creativity to flow and can help you get back to a lot of those struggles or those challenges that you might have been facing that day with a clear head.
Very cool. So I usually jump into, tell us your origin story, and you have an interesting one, and I want to get there, but I don't want to lose this because I think it's so interesting that you said that you breathe, you take time, you process, and I've seen that about you. I know that when we were in class together, you would process things in the class, and then you'd come up to me afterwards, and we would process together, and then you make another phone call to a mentor and process more, and then you would take action. So to all of those who are watching either live or watching the recording, first of all, say hi, join in the conversation. That's why we have these things live. But to all of those out there, oftentimes I feel like we have people who are that they do want to fight for the cause, but they don't know how to properly do that. And sometimes they're just so filled with passion that they just rush into it, or they're so scared of being too passionate and that this could blow back on them, so they avoid altogether. You've got this fire and this passion, but you what you do really well is breathe. You process and you go in armed with facts and understanding, your viewpoint on this and trying to get it from another perspective. I love that you're able to do that. Can you speak to that a little bit? Is that difficult for you to sort of say, hold on, got to process this?
Yes, it absolutely is. It is a learned skill. It was not something that came naturally for me. It was not innate. I was not born with it. I had to hone it over time through a variety of very, very intense challenges, personal and professional. And it took a lot to get me to this point. Full disclosure, I've been in therapy now for 14 years. That was a big part, that committing to my own mental health and really my own overall well-being, because being in therapy wasn't just about getting myself to be emotionally responsible and not being reactive anymore, getting that maturity. It was also about being able to commit to myself, my physical health, and then also my professional health and well-being, being able to, sorry, my light likes to shut off. It's going to stay dark in here. That's fine. But a big part of that was being able to have the drive and the ambition honed into a goal and a purpose, and being able to commit to that, having the discipline to commit to something. Especially, I mean, it took me 13 years, a little bit of my origin story. It took me 13 years to finish my graduate degree. And my undergraduate combined. And that took a lot of focus. And one of the number one things that a very dear friend of mine taught me was being present in the moment, each moment, and breathing. And that's why I say those are the two best pieces of advice, is because that got me through. Sometimes I would be so overwhelmed emotionally that I would have to do it minute to minute, just breathing and getting through. And I take that with me every single day into every situation that I face.
That's so interesting. I tell my kids all the time that the things that get them in trouble with their mom and I now are the things that are going to make them incredibly successful humans later. It's like these gifts are wrapped up in these complex ways where you need to hone them. And we all have these things that have both sides to them, and that passion, be learning to give it direction, it just makes you so powerful. But before then, I can imagine that it would work against you. So thanks for sharing.
It did.
So all right, just as much as you're comfortable to share, maybe you could share some pieces of that while you share your origin story. How did you get here? How did you decide to become an IO psychology practitioner? What was that journey like?
Well, it was a very, very interesting journey that I didn't actually realize until my senior year in my undergraduate degree, which was, that was 2015, or I'm sorry, no, that was 2019, 2020 was around that time. Time gets weird after COVID. So it was just before I entered the program there at University of Maryland. I had noticed I'd always had an interest in psychology, and I think most people that I've encountered with a traumatic background have an interest in psychology, and I think it's this way of understanding ourselves, understanding our experiences, but also trying to understand the people that wronged us in ways that not necessarily rationalize it, but make it easy to come to terms with, easier to accept, because otherwise it's just, that you've experienced true evil in the world. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think people's behaviors are the result of a number of things, and that's what psychology taught me. One of the key principles in philosophy that I always adhere to is that man is not the sum of his actions. And that was what drove me into psychology. And from there, while I was working, I just realized that so many people were unhappy with what they were doing. So many people were just dissatisfied. So many people were bad leaders. And it really struck me that there has to be something to be done. And that was when I took a senior seminar in IO psychology, and I learned all about it. I had a phenomenal professor up at Penn State. He was so engaging and energetic and bubbly, and I was so motivated by him that I thought that's what I want to do. That's not even what I want to do. That's what I need to do.
Hmm.
I never subscribed to a calling before, but I realized at that time that was my calling and that I had a calling. So from there, the rest was history. I applied to the program at UMD. I got accepted, took a couple of your classes, and here I am.
Awesome. So yeah, what was work for you then? Because you ended up you ended up set like in therapy, interest in psychology, and then you realized IO psychology, the psychology happening at work was that was what you wanted to get more involved in. When you were growing up with and going through all of these difficult situations in life, what was work for you? Was it sort of an escape, or was it like more of an impediment? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so work was definitely an escape. The way that I grew up is very unconventional. I lost my father at a very early age. I lost him to suicide. So that was my first experience with real mental health challenges and what that looks like, especially for the families that are left to deal with it. I also grew up with an alcoholic mother, and she had a drug problem. And that was another challenge that I faced. I had two younger brothers that I would often find myself caring for, very, very early on. And when I got into high school and I got to a working age, I worked 40 hours a week while I was going to high school full time.
Wow.
I never wanted to be at home. I only went home to sleep.
Hmm.
The rest of my day was spent at school and at work. And that I think that's why I had such an early exposure to what the working world is like, what good leaders look like, what fast food leaders look like, because they are very, very different. But I made a lot of friends because there were a lot of kind, caring people there who also came from traumatic backgrounds and understood that, and we really connected. Going back to my comment about connectedness, I think that was really what motivated me to learn more about work and to really figure that out and navigate that space.
Wow. So I love this idea that work was that is sort of oasis for you. It got you away from the home, and so you saw the beauty of what work could be, and that sense of community that you had at work and that safe place that you had at work. But then going through your career, you saw the other side as well, right? You've alluded to that, seeing what good management is, but also what bad leaders look like. And what does that side look like?
I've been screamed at over making tea wrong.
Huh.
That was an interesting job. I have just heard just some of the most oddball things. There was one manager that I had. I was working in food service as a server, and I had 104-degree temperature. I was sick with some kind of communicable illness, and I had begged to go home. And she followed me to my car to make sure that I wasn't going to go walk around the mall, that I wasn't just trying to leave. That was odd.
Huh.
Um, I'll never forget that day because I fell asleep in my car after taking some Advil because I was so sick. And after that, I left that job, but I was just so floored that she would lack the trust in me. We're talking a little bit about trust in today. And that was like my first real experience with that, just that entire concept. Just if an employee comes to you and says that they're sick and they need to go home, and you are not only not convinced, but you're going to take action and follow them to their car. That was a whole new level for me. So there have been a number of other experiences, but that one really stood out to me. And that was probably, oh gosh, I think that was 12, 13 years ago that
Oh,
happened, but it
oh,
hasn't left me, because I want to change that. I want to make sure that I'm not working with leaders that are not trusting their employees and respecting them. I mean, it was disrespectful.
yeah. And so you've worked both for as the employee being non-trusted by leadership, but you've also been in leadership roles where I'm sure you've learned that you've maybe pushed back against learning, but you've learned a little bit like it's hard to trust frontline employees sometimes. And so there's distrust happening in both directions. You had mentioned earlier the importance of understanding sort of what motivates people, sort of what's behind the person's actions, right? And so what is behind this? Especially right now, we see this issue with trust in every arena of our life. Trust is not doing so well. So what motivates us to distrust people? Why do we have such an issue right now?
That's a really good question. And I think it is a very complicated one. There's no one right answer, it's all circumstantial. And I think in the case of my manager that followed me to my car, I think it was, food service. There are a number of employees that go into those lines of work, and a lot of young adults that might be partiers. They might not want to show up for their shift if they're a little hungover, and that may have burned her in the past. And she's carrying that bias with her. She's carrying that assumption with her. And that's why, I said in our 6 and 60 is that if we can work with people to train them on how not to carry those biases into those interactions with their employees, I think that's one great way to counter those trust issues. And that does go both ways. I think there's a huge movement that I've seen on TikTok and Instagram in particular, where people are really denigrating their leadership. And I'm not saying that they're not wrong, but at the same time, I think it's giving this really, really negative predisposition when you go into a job that managers and leaders are all exploitative, and they're all just looking
Right.
to get the most out of you and pay you the less or the least, and not give you any PTO, and all of these kinds of assumptions. And that, I mean, that's one of the worst parts of social media, is how it can really propagate those ideas.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there's a lot happening in the reasons why we don't trust each other. And there's really not a very clear answer on that.
Yeah, yeah, but you did talk about how that one incident with one manager following you to your car stands out in your mind. And I know I remember working on a team of managers, and it was like so many of them, the pressure was on all of us. Our full-time job became policing, looking for theft, looking for people who were taking unauthorized breaks, looking for. We were constantly on the lookout for all this, and it felt so wrong. But you get screwed over by one manager, you get screwed over by one employee, and you decide that's not going to happen to me again, and you throw everybody in that same basket, and in the meantime you miss all of those amazing interactions, all of those people that really do want to do good work, right? And so I think it's it's a cycle that needs to be broken. But I agree with you. Social media isn't helping. The fastest growing discussion board on the entire internet over the course of COVID was anti-work on Reddit, the anti-work discussion board on Reddit. And if you've seen those posts, they're really interesting, showing nasty text messages from bosses, bragging
Mhm.
about how they walked out of the job, things like that. And it doesn't seem healthy for society right now. And it seems like somebody's got to break the pattern. Who breaks the pattern and how?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that falls a lot on the HR team, and it's not always an HR team that is knowledgeable in fielding those kinds of problems. HR positions are typically very, very administrative, and they involve a lot of those just rote tasks that have to be performed when it comes to onboarding, W-4s, benefits administration, a number of those things, and those are very, very cumbersome things to deal with. And so you're looking at an overburdened HR team that is tasked with solving really complex employee relations issues, and there isn't the time. And it's really unfortunate. I think if I'm going to really toot our own horn here, I think IO psychology is one of the best ways forward because of what it teaches. And one of the things that I took away from every single psychology class that I took in undergrad or graduate degree was being able to counter your own bias. It's such an undervalued skill, being able to go into each interaction and have the metacognition to think about your thinking. Okay, why am I feeling this way? What is motivating me to say these things? How can I counter this? Am I really addressing this person and this situation, or am I addressing this situation based on everything else that I've experienced? And I mean, I don't think there was a single class that I took that didn't talk about that in some way or another.
Yeah, right. And I think that way of thinking that you developed as an IO, but also maybe being that quote unquote late bloomer,
Hmm.
gives you a different way to think about things. Do you feel that in the workplace you're looking at things differently than other people, and it seems like everybody else is stuck in the matrix, and you're like, you don't see this? Is that a common frustration?
Sometimes I've actually learned to be less frustrated by it and to be more curious about it, to ask more questions. I've experienced that with people as high up as presidents and CEOs, listening to their really just complaints. It's a lot of emotion. I never really expected that at the executive levels, but it is very much there, and it is pervasive. That they can be very, very emotional, overly so at times. And so to be able to hear that and process it in a way that poses the right questions that get to the right solutions that are not influenced by emotion. So that's one of the biggest key strategies that I took away from not only my experience but also the IO psychology program. You might really be correct in stating that my age and my experience level have a lot to do with how I can perceive things. I also believe that we can start teaching our young adults these concepts and these strategies at a much earlier age. But again, I just don't think it is as prevalent in our society as it could and should be when it comes to the working world. We're missing that we train managers, but I don't often quote the military, but one of the things that I read it was a Marine authored book, was we manage things and lead people. And when you're assigned the title of a manager, when people think about their job titles, they often run with them. And when they think like, I'm your manager, that is a very authoritarian style role.
Yeah.
When you think about the term leader and you're writing job descriptions and you're writing job titles as a leader, as opposed to saying a manager, you're changing the entire context of the situation. Like, you're not a manager at that point, you have a following. And then that puts more accountability on you to put the effort in that reflects back on you. When you put people in a managerial role, you're kind of saying to them like, well, there are these things out there, these people that you have to manage, and it takes the accountability and the onus away on their performance when it really ties back to the leader that's in the position.
Yeah, yeah, these human resources, right? I kind of don't like that title because words matter, right?
Yeah.
So that brings us to Madeline's question. How do you recommend we advocate for ourselves at work so that we aren't taken advantage of? Which I think is a great question because talking about that cycle, what if you're the one whose manager or leader is distrusting and or taking advantage of somebody? How are we not supposed to grow negative about that and distrusting of that? How are we supposed to advocate for ourselves without continuing the cycle? I guess.
The first thing I always tell anyone is to know your rights. Like, you have to know your rights, whatever it is that you're dealing with. If it's applicable to any of the federal protections are in place, that's the first thing that you want to do. You want to know when you're going into a meeting with your manager or your human resources team, you want to know what is available to you in the way of resources that your employer is required to provide. And I think the other thing is do your best not to make assumptions about your manager, and be as honest with them as you can be and as you feel is appropriate. You don't need to overshare. Sometimes it's just a simple conversation like, I have X medical concern and I need X time off. It doesn't really need to be more than that. Employers aren't required to do that. And as far as doctor's notes and things like that are concerned, your manager isn't required to receive that either. HR is the one that keeps it on file, and they do that for a lot of protective layers.
Right.
So when it comes to advocating for yourself, it's just about knowing what's available to you and being able to have that communication. If it is a manager that you do not trust, I mean, that's why HR exists. And if you don't have HR, I've been in that situation before, and it can be really, really difficult, and terrifying sometimes. I had a manager that I worked with that was very, very intimidating and very difficult to speak to. And when we had to go in to ask for certain accommodations, we were always afraid of the passive aggressiveness that
Mm-hmm.
might follow, or the any type of like just repercussions that might come in line with that. It was just a very difficult working environment. So I understand that as well. And that's why I always tell people to know your rights. If you're going in to ask for reasonable accommodations and your manager is going to treat you that way, there's always EEO and a labor lawyer. I don't
Right.
like to say that 'cause I'm not a litigious person, but that's how you hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah, I recently had somebody who I'm not gonna um, tell you the specific relationship because I don't want to put them on blast, but they came to me and they said that they recently learned that they're being paid much less than a coworker who does much less on the job. And I said, well, you should go and speak to your boss about it or go speak to HR about it. And the individual said, well, I can't. And I said, why not? He said, because if they knew that I had that conversation, I'd be in trouble. And then he brought me the handbook. And in the handbook, it said that it is that it's grounds for termination if you discuss your pay with your colleagues. And as hopefully most of us know, that's not legal. You can't put that in a handbook or have that rule generally. So yeah, I agree. Knowing your rights is a big piece of it. But hopefully it never gets to that point. But what can managers do on the front end to build trust and even more so to rebuild trust? Because a lot of people who are listening, maybe they're managers themselves and they feel like there's a lack of trust in them from their people. And maybe there are some HR professionals who are listening who see that they have managers who have no trust in them from their people. So, what can you do to build trust in the first place, but also to rebuild trust if it's already broken?
Yeah. Well, I mean, building trust is, in my opinion, in my experience, a lot easier than rebuilding trust. Because when you build trust, you're really just starting from zero. When you're rebuilding trust, you're starting in the negative. So you have a lot further to go. But the number one thing that I've experienced that will aid in gaining trust from the start is authenticity. When you come across as disingenuous when you're saying certain things, or you're just platitudes, you're handing out platitudes to people and things like that, it doesn't feel genuine or authentic. So one of the number one things that you can do is just be yourself, and communicate your feelings and thoughts on things, share in other people's experiences, go into it with empathy, and really to have compassion for people. Everyone is fighting their own war, and they may come to work bearing the weight of 1,000 battles, and that you don't even know, you won't even see them. So going into it, and that goes back to not having those assumptions and biases. If their performance is lacking, and they previously have been great performers, that's a really good conversation to have. That's an opportunity. I think we're not having enough conversations. That's the other side of it, is, building trust is about communication, but it's not just about communicating. It's about the quality of the communication. You can't just go out and communicate and say words without having quality, in-depth conversations and understanding your employees, who they are as people, and really help take that information and help guide them on how to be more productive, or offering, there are plenty of times where people can be offered, a day off or an afternoon off if they're really having a bad day. And I think that gets missed so often, because they'll have pizza parties. It's like, there's pizza and ice cream in the break room, like, help yourself. It's like, that's not, people don't want that. They want their time back. They cash incentives and cash bonuses are great, but people, generally speaking, want their time. We see the relationship between pay and happiness, and it starts to really plateau and drop off at a certain point once people's basic needs are met. And salary is a whole other struggle, but once you're meeting people's basic needs, and they're not communicating their salary as a problem, give them time. Give them an extra PTO day, let them earn flex time, those kinds of things. I ran off on a tangent, but at the end of the day, like, authenticity, compassion, really just those two things are so overlooked and undervalued.
So I agree with you on the on all these points, but on the authenticity point, why is it so difficult for managers often to be authentic with their employees? Where does that difficulty come from? And is this something that someone within the organization can do something about? Maybe within HR.
I think a lot of it can come from hiring, right? Pulling in the right people to the right positions. But at the same time, I think it can be looked at as an overall business strategy. KPIs can get in the way of looking at a person as a person. And I think when we look at these metrics and we assign these metrics and these responsibilities to these managers, we put the pressure on them to make their team perform. And we don't always give them the skills to help show them how to get their people to perform and what that means, and the soft skills that are required for that. I mean, the soft skills are so important when you're talking about management, middle management, and even at the executive level, those kinds of skills are not taught when it comes to getting your business administration degree or even your MBA. It's not as popular. I notice at Wharton, because Adam Grant is one of my professional heroes, and he speaks a lot on that. But it's not always as common to learn those business skills, those soft skills alongside those business skills. And you need both if you're going to lead people. You absolutely need both.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen a lot where middle management are so insecure because the way they're being treated and the way their performance is being measured and everything, like you said, is counter to how they're being told to treat their employees, right?
Hmm.
And so it becomes very confusing. Like, what am I supposed to be doing here? And so I think that's why we see managers have the highest burnout rates, higher than their employees right now. And so you've got all of this stuff. So the executive leadership, they're not treating people down the chain the same way they want people at the bottom of the chain to be treated, because they know you want your frontline employees to be happy and engaged. Otherwise, all these awful things happen. But your managers, if they're driven enough, they'll just keep going. They'll keep putting up with abuse. But they don't see the connection that if I'm abusing my manager's gonna abuse my employees.
You know, you mentioned that, and it's actually kind of funny. So I think about being a parent, and we often tell our kids what we want them to do and how we want them to behave without showing them. And if you've taken psychology and developmental psychology, you know about modeling theory, and you know that children don't learn what they're told. They don't learn what they're taught. They learn what they see. And they're only going to treat other people the way that they see you treating them or treating each other, especially when it comes to relationships, the parental relationship in the family. So you're absolutely right. I think that also goes to adults. I mean, adult learning theory varies slightly from when we talk about building curriculum for elementary school and high schoolers, but not a whole lot. We look at the 80, what is it, the 70-20-10 model, the learning model. The 70% is application, but the other 20%, which is a good chunk of it, is that shadowing portion. It's being able to see it done. So if they're 20% of the time, they're seeing their leaders and their team, their executive team, treat people disrespectfully and really like get into the grind culture and push out those numbers and the bottom line and all these KPIs and everything, then they're absolutely going to push that downward. So it's about setting the culture of trust. And I don't think I've ever used that term, but it's a culture of trust. You've got to be able, it's got to be culture of trust and respect within the entire organization. Otherwise, yeah, you can't treat your managers like crap and expect them not to treat their employees like crap,
Right.
or leave if they don't like it.
Yeah, exactly. Or want to leave and not leave, which is even worse, right?
Arguably, yes, worse. It's a
Yeah.
lot more expensive.
Right. Right. So, um, shifting gears a little bit, you talk about building this culture of trust, which I love. And you also talked about the pizza parties just don't hit the spot. I hate the pizza parties with a passion, even though I happen to love pizza. But but you the workplace has become much more diverse in so many different ways, and especially as we ask people to be, or people are demanding to bring their authentic self to work, right? For their own
Mhm.
mental well-being. You're seeing how diverse your people really are. Part of the problem with pizza parties is that it's just slap a pizza on the table. There's no thought and there's no individualized sort of care that goes into it. How do you build this culture of trust and rapport within a diverse work environment? Is there how do you do this so that it's sort of specialized for different people and different needs? And how do you rationalize between equality and equity? How do those two things kind of where how do you create this culture of trust where there's fairness? I would think is a big piece of trust. How do you deal with people on an individual level while still having this feeling of fairness across the board?
Well, fairness is hard for me because, again, I'm a parent, so not everything's always fair. And that's why we have things like reasonable accommodations and a legal requirement to meet them as well, because we understand that things that are fair are not always equitable. And one of the, actually going back to social media, I did see a good post. They do happen. There was a reel that I watched, and it was a teacher she was talking about a lesson that she gives to her, I think it was first graders, about fairness versus equity. And she had a stack of Band-Aids, and she went around to the class and she started asking students, okay, has anybody fallen and hurt their elbow? And students would raise their hand. So the students that raised their hand got a Band-Aid on their elbow. And she would ask the students, okay, has anybody ever fallen and hurt your knee? She would walk around and give everybody who had fallen and hurt their knee a Band-Aid for their elbow. And then she went on to say, has anybody ever hurt their head? And they would raise their hand. She would give them a Band-Aid for their elbow. And it was a lesson on how everything that is fair and equal is not always equitable. So just because, one student gets to have a snack in the class because he has diabetes doesn't mean that everybody has to get a snack. So I think that that's a good conversation to have, not specifically that, because obviously it might come across as patronizing, but it is a good conversation to have with your team that not everything that is fair is going to be equitable, and we need to be able to address things on a case-by-case basis. So aside from that, when it comes to interacting with employees on a substantial and individual basis, you have to come equipped, again, with that ability to have that forethought and metacognition. When you have these conversations, you have to be able to counter your biases, counter your assumptions, and take pause. I go back to breathing. Take pause. Make sure that when you are thinking about what you're going to say and how you're going to respond, that it is not laden with your own assumptions and biases about the situation. And if you can't get to that place, take the time to respond. So, let the employee unburden themselves with whatever it is that they're dealing with or what they need, and then say, I'm going to get back to you on this. The other thing is having compassion and empathy for them. You don't always have to give them an immediate response. You can give a time window to come up, because not everything is going to warrant an immediate response. I used to be a very reactionary person, and being in the program at UMD, the master's program, and having a lot of really challenging experiences over the last few months have really given me the skill of taking pause and letting something sit with you for a good amount of time until you know how to move forward, and that you've talked to the right people. You talk about how often I reach out to you and really all this staff. I mean, it's such a wonderful network that I've built, and not just the staff, but our core cohort mates as well. I've reached out to them. We've had conversations, reaching out to your network and making sure, like, hey, am I missing something here? And I think we tend to be very reactionary in situations. And if we can help people understand that you can take the time to make a decision, and talk to the right people, bring in resources, pull strategies from other people and run it by them to see if maybe there's something that you're missing or some assumption that you're making about something. I mean, those are really, really key skills that we can give to leaders and managers that will help really circumvent a lot of those immediate reactionary issues that we're facing.
Yeah, I love everything you said there, especially the part about reaching out to me. But this is no, but the reality of it is that everything you were talking about, reaching out to your cohort, reaching out to your past professors, reaching out to whatever resources you have, it all starts with one single element, and that is knowing and admitting the fact that you don't have all of the answers. And I think that that's scary, especially middle management, where you're competing for, typically the org chart goes like this, right? So there's less and less spots available, and you're competing, and you're trying to look like you are great at what you do and have all the answers, and you're the best. And so we sometimes, I think, see it as a weak spot to ask for help. And I would also challenge that one of those key resources, that's the employee themselves, right? So that oftentimes we're making these assumptions and we don't just ask. We don't just ask the question. You talk about, rapport, and that piece of communication going two ways is so important. But I know that you've had experiences where the communication doesn't flow up for a variety of reasons. So, what could a manager do to make that happen? Because I know you're just as much a cynic as I am, maybe even slightly more. And I don't think you buy into the whole. Well, I tell them all I have an open door policy.
I hate that term.
I knew you
Yeah.
would.
Well, I've experienced the open door policy. It doesn't always work that way because there can often be repercussions for coming to your leaders with complaints and saying, like, this just isn't working. We need to do something differently. And usually it doesn't bring about change. Nothing happens. And then the manager will just view you differently after that point because they know you're discontented in some way. And I think being able to have and foster humility among your staff, but among the executive level of the leaders, like being able to accept that you're not going to have all the answers. That's why we have, a brain trust of executives. We want all of those perspectives. We should all be working together and talking these things through and figuring them out as a team. That is our function. To not even just worry about our downward teams and looking downward, but also like the 5-10,000 foot view, and how are we all working to achieve the same mission. And I think that's another side of it that can really get lost is people get so focused and so myopic that they're focused on their one job and they don't view it as a collective. They don't view it as this overall mission that they're serving. And I think a lot of that has to go with people just having these authoritarian ideas about what it means to manage people and to manage their tasks. And they often lose sight of it. So it's not easy, but being able to help people understand that we're not going to judge you for not knowing. Like, I don't know. I've said that a lot. Like, I don't have that information, but I know resources that I can turn to. That's where the confidence should really come from, is your ability to research and to deep dive and to be curious. There's no shame in not knowing. And I think as a society, we've put so much emphasis on having all the answers, being reactive. And we need to counter that by saying, it's okay. It's okay. All right, great. Like, you have resources. Can I give you 2 days? Can you come back to me with those resources and we can reconvene and re-strategize? And that's what I do in my work. I will often, all the time, admit when I don't know something. I still am fairly new to the field and to the arena of human resources, human capital, people ops, whatever it's being called these days. But one of the things that I really take into every day is humility and just trying to be as self-aware as I can on what I do know and what I can say, but also I can't answer all of these questions for you.
Yeah, and it's kind of refreshing when you get that answer from someone, because now they're going to put thought into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't trust someone who has all the answers. To me, that, charlatan, snake oil salesman.
Right. It's kind of like, we see this all the time in the master's program, where these people who maybe they were top of their career or just entering their career, whatever it is, they decide that they're going to be an IO, and maybe 1 term in, 2 terms in, they realize how much they don't know, and they think, I know nothing, therefore I don't have a seat here. Like, I don't belong here. But then slowly you start to realize, like, oh, having access to all this knowledge, understanding what I don't know, and that my job is to find the knowledge as I need it, that starts to break down that imposter syndrome a little bit. So I love that you have the confidence with that, but a lot of people struggle with that.
Well, I didn't at first. It was really hard, especially navigating a new career space. One of the things that my husband always told me was, like, people are just people. They're just people.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a very tough time going into positions where I was working directly with CEOs, directly with presidents. And I was very, very intimidated by the position and the power that it holds. And that made it more real for me, and just reminding myself that people are just people and not everyone has all the answers. So I don't have to have all the answers either.
Right. People with slightly bigger houses sometimes, but just people. That's
Yeah, word bars, but that's okay.
right. Right. Okay. Well, I'm gonna ask you to, on the spot, to think of an answer to this question, which is, I'm an HR professional. I'm struggling with building trust within my organization. There's definitely a lack of trust going in every which direction. What is the first thing I should do? Okay, think of it as the role, maybe an HR director kind of role. Okay, but while you're thinking of that, I want to invite people to connect with you. Alicia is clearly just an amazing resource of information. And not only that, if you come to her and she doesn't have the answers, then she'll go out and find it. So think about how that expands her utility as a resource. That's awesome. So if you want to continue the conversation, which hopefully you do, whether you have a ton of distrust in your organization or you're just always trying to Kaizen and take it to the next level and create more trust and rapport, as this is such an important commodity within an organization, please reach out to Alicia. This QR code, if you lift your phone up to the QR code above Alicia's head, that'll take you to her LinkedIn page, which is the best way for them to contact you. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And if you and I are not yet connected, shame on you. Please go over my QR code and connect with me as well. I'd love to continue the conversation. But in the meantime, I want to invite you all next WaterCooler Wednesday, 2 weeks from now. We are hosting JJ Ruskas. He is a human optimization strategist. This guy is so intimidating. He's talk about continuous learning. He's constantly working on perfecting himself as a human being. Having a one-on-one with him was like eye-opening and intimidating all at the same time. But I'm really honored for him to come and talk about becoming your best self, where we'll talk about strategies for personal optimization. Exactly what does that mean? What does that look like? But hopefully he'll have some nuggets to make you, help you develop as a better person and a better leader. Alicia, back to you. All right. So I'm an HR director. I'm thinking I need to rebuild trust within this organization. What's the first thing that I should do?
Well, it's not an easy problem to solve. It is a very long-term, complicated commitment to make, and primarily relies on a good, solid communication strategy and how and what you communicate. But I think one of the, and this is probably one of the best ways to address it with those executives and those leaders higher up, is to look at it from kind of a Machiavellian perspective. In that the more your employees trust you, the more loyal and engaged they will be. So at the end of the day, the more trust that you can foster in your organization, and the more respect and the more connectedness and everything that you can build between yourself, not your employees and each other, but yourself and your team, your employees, the more loyal, the more engaged, the more productive they will be to you, which will ultimately impact your bottom line the most.
Awesome. I love that. So we're supposed to assume the best, even in our executives, but also talk to them about the bottom line, because at the end of the day, that's where they see their job, right?
That's right.
That's great advice. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you all for tuning in today. It's been awesome. I hope you can Tune in again in 2 weeks, and we'll have to bring Alicia back for a round two because there's just so much here. Okay. And we
Thanks.
will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.